Hi, this is Greg Goernert of Goernert Wealth Management, and this is my Insights and Perspectives podcast. Welcome to Insights and Perspectives If I Knew Then, the show where we share the stories of the successes and challenges that entrepreneurs overcome on a daily basis as they build extraordinary businesses. We celebrate their triumphs both personally and professionally, learn from their setbacks, and reflect on what they've discovered about themselves. Joining me this month is Steve Power, founder of PowerWood Lumber. If you can go back 20 years ago and give Steve Power one piece of advice, what would you say to him?
There's a lot of odds against me.
Well, there's no question that the U.S. economy is slowing down dramatically. The December policy mistake by the U.S. Fed has yet to be fully rectified, and now the drawn-out trade war between the U.S. and China is taking its toll on U.S. economic activity. Further, military tensions with Iran after the recent shooting down by the Iranians of a U.S. military drone have increased global apprehension. The BRIC countries, led by China and India, are reflating their economies with rate cuts and fiscal measures, while, in the developed world, the Bank of Japan, ECB, Reserve Bank of Australia, and now the U.S. Fed have validated rate cut expectations. This has led to a sharp run-up in the price of gold, which is trading at levels not seen in 6 years. Now in Canada, economic and inflation data are coming in better than expected as the country shows continued positive economic momentum. This momentum should continue as global reflation efforts, coupled with a weakening U.S. dollar, boost the price of commodities. This is positive for the Canadian dollar and will probably allow Bank of Canada Governor Stephen Poloz to remain on the sidelines a little bit longer. And now, to our monthly If I Knew Then interview. My guest today is the founder of PowerWood Corp. Starting in 1995 from the basement of his home, he grew his cedar lumber company into a successful business, employing more than 21 employees. Welcome, Steve Power.
Thank you.
Now, can you take me back a little bit to, maybe when you got out of school, where did your whole journey start? Because I know from talking with you in the past, it didn't just start in the basement of your home, which is an amazing story. But walk me back to how you got into the lumber business and how you got here today.
Sure. Well, I started, I'll go back even farther. My family is a lumber family. Mm-hmm. My grandfather worked for the pulp mill in New Westminster.
Okay.
Back when the war was on. My dad had his own lumber business, retail lumber company, and he also had 17 children.
Wow.
And I'm one of 10 boys and one of 6 boys that went into the lumber business. And it's kind of strange, but none of us worked together.
That's interesting.
We all worked together at certain times, but we all ended up in our own businesses.
Right. Did you start off working in the pulp mill with your dad?
No, my dad never worked in the pulp mill, just my grandfather.
Okay, grandfather.
My dad went right into lumber.
Right.
And from there, he set the tone for his boys. He was very proud of it, loved the industry.
Yeah.
Talked about it pretty well at every meal.
Right.
And then the boys caught fire on that and went out into the industry. And
so what year would this be?
When I went out?
Yeah.
Well, I went to school. I went to BCIT and took the wood sciences program there. Got the woodworks degree. Mm-hmm. And in 1978, I got my first job and got married all in the matter of 3 weeks.
Holy smokes.
Yeah.
Okay.
And my first job was with a very large company called Ralph S. Plant. And they were the largest lumber broker in Canada at the time, so I got real good training with them. They're a tremendous company. Mm-hmm. And we had about 40 traders on the main floor, if my memory is correct.
Because that's back in the late 70s, early 80s when lumber was huge. We had the Lodell. We had...
Exactly. The lumber business was booming.
Yeah.
Kind of. It goes up and down like it still does today. But it was. I think the estimated percentage of value to the BC economy was between 65 and 75%.
Wow.
So for every dollar earned in BC, between 65 and 75% of that came from the lumber business.
Interesting. I had no idea. Our family moved out from Montreal in 1979. So my dad moved out and he worked in the pulp and paper industry at that point. So up to that point, I had no idea how the lumber industry worked. And then when I moved out here, I ended up working the mill in the summers.
Did you? Okay.
I worked for the Forestry department,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
I worked in the in the pulping group, and the the white liquor and the black liquor, and
Okay,
in the
yeah.
machine room, and that
Right,
was
right.
so-
That was a different part of the lumber business,
yeah, and then
but still a big part of it.
yeah,
Yeah.
but just to see, because the other side of the business was, you could definitely see all the logging camps that were up there, and just to
course,
see
yeah.
just the sheer size of the meaning to the economy at that point was just so big in the late 70s. Yeah.
Now, I just heard recently it now holds between 12 and 15% of the economy.
Wow.
So in better part of 40, 45 years, it's gone from 65 to 75 to 12 to 15%.
What a difference.
Yeah, a lot to do with forestry practices, I'm sure. Pine beetle has been huge.
Yeah.
It's wiped out, I don't know the figure, but a very large percentage of all the pine in British Columbia. So you're starting to read the big mills are starting to curtail now. Mm-hmm. Mills are closing that were dependent on pine.
Yeah.
And the whole industry has become circles around 4 or 5 major companies. All the little guys have been gobbled up.
Right, because the pine beetle was more of an interior mill
Yes.
issue.
It attacks the pine tree.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, I worked for Ralph S. Plant, and I traded spruce and pine.
Yeah.
Mostly into the local market, the Vancouver market. And that was wearing a bit thin, so I migrated down to Washington State.
Okay.
And started trading into Washington State, and then up into Alaska. And I'd been there about 2 or 3 years, and on my 3rd year, the owner of the company asked me to run the Calgary Distribution Center. So that was in 1981. And so I went there with my wife and my pregnant wife, and we had our first child in Calgary.
Yeah.
And then 1982 hit. You're probably too young to remember 1982. But anyway, the world crashed around us.
Yeah.
So the company laid off 30 to 40% of their employees. And I was left in Calgary basically 23, 24 years old, on my own, no forklift driver, so I was running everything in it. So we decided to move home, and we went to work with my brother Pat, who owned a company called Pat Power Forest.
Okay.
And I worked for Pat for 13 years, very successfully. I ended up basically running the company. He and I did. He was away a lot at the end, and I was left to run the company. And then families being as they are, we had a little tiff, and we decided to go our separate ways. And so on Friday afternoon, I left Pat Power Forest Products, and Monday morning, I was trading lumber on my own. I had no preparation. I didn't phone anyone or make plans. I just said to my wife, well, we got to start.
Right.
So I started first thing Monday, and worked in the basement of my home all by myself, and traded lumber back and forth. I did the best I could, and after 30 days, I kind of counted everything up, and I said to my wife, I think we made $30,000 this month. I think we can do this.
Wow.
And so from then on, just a month later, I hired my first secretary. And she stayed with me just basically until I retired. And then I hired a lady who had been working for my brother Pat, but she wanted out, so I hired her, and she brought the computers into the company.
Right. So are you still in your basement, or where are you now?
Still in the basement.
Still in the basement,
yeah.
keeping it small, keeping it lean.
Yeah, and then I started doing remanufacturing, which is taking raw lumber and making it into finished lumber.
Right.
To make a long story short.
Right. Okay.
And so I hired a fellow, and he came in, a guy by the name of Ray Sitter, and he came in to be my quality control man. And he would follow the lumber around to the different plants in Vancouver and make sure that it was done right. So I'd been in my house for about a year, and my wife finally said, hey, we can't have all these people in our home. So I found a little office just a few blocks away.
Yeah.
And we started working in our first home away from home.
Yeah.
And I asked my wife asked my youngest son, he was getting pretty used to having Dad home all the time.
Yeah.
She said, Jared, how do you feel having Dad move out of the house? And he said, I'm glad.
How old was he then?
He was about 6 or 7.
Okay.
And she said, well, why would you be glad? He says, because now when he's home, he's at home. So it was quite
That is so
astute
important.
Thing that the young fella said.
That is really interesting too,
yeah.
because a lot of times, I hear this so often, and I do it too. When I work from home, you're not home. You're focused there, and it's
Yes.
like I can't talk to you, and it's a distant relationship at that point.
Right.
It's like,
He comes down to visit me, and I'm busy, and I have to shoo him away. And
Yeah.
he got tired of that. So
Yeah.
it was a real eye opener for me, and it was good that we moved out. So we worked in the next office for about 3 or 4 years, and I built the staff up. We had 5 or 6 employees in that office, two traders, so salespeople, and a couple of secretaries, and it was starting to bulge at the seams.
Yeah.
So we rented a much larger office, again about a half a mile away, on Schoolhouse Street in Coquitlam.
Right, I know what that is.
Yeah. And we worked there I signed a lease for 5 years. And after about 2 years, we rented a distribution yard in Port Kells. And it was just a matter of a year or two, and I realized I needed my own yard. So we purchased Weyerhaeuser's distribution center on 190th Street in Port Kells. Then a quality control man. And it was getting very difficult because we were selling a lot of wood now, and all our wood was being remanufactured through custom plants.
Okay,
So
what does that mean?
It wasn't our own plant. It's
Okay.
a plant set up to do work for companies like mine.
Okay.
So my shtick in life was kiln drying lumber,
Okay.
Western red cedar,
Yeah.
and putting it on the shelf and waiting for orders. So I'd have raw material, kiln dried and ready to go. And then when the orders came in, I would send the wood out, the appropriate wood out to the appropriate plant, and have it run into siding or decking or fascia board or whatever. And we needed quality control people to go with that. So it was becoming a mess. Our trucking bill every year was unbelievably high. And some
Now,
of
how far away would those mills be?
they were
those
in
plants?
the greater Vancouver area all the way up to Chilliwack.
Okay, so you get some big trucking costs there and transportation costs.
I think
so
one year our local transportation cost was $250,000.
Ouch.
So a big cost.
Yeah.
So anyway, I talked about it with my guys, and we thought, well, we better buy a place and start doing our own, because we had a lot of very small orders, and these custom plants wanted big orders. It
Right.
was very difficult for them to do onesie-twosies, if you will.
Right.
So anyway, we decided to look around. I bought some property from Weyerhaeuser, 5 acres out in Port Kells, and started our venture on expanding the business from basically a custom reman company to a secondary plant.
Right.
So we started it by putting in basically a distribution center.
Right.
And then we put some saws in and some planers in, and built it up from there. And that was about... Oh, and then I bought a swack of kilns from the old Fraser Mills in New Westminster. I think I had 3 or 4 of them. And by the time we got the kilns set up and ready to go, the industry took a big crash in 2007 and 8.
Okay, this is the financial crisis time.
Like everywhere else.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and now you've just gone out, you got the property, you bought the kilns. How much did the kilns cost?
Well, they weren't that much. They were about $120,000. They were used,
Right.
but we had to disassemble them, truck them to our
Right.
property, reassemble them, and modify them to meet code.
So, how many employees do you have at this point? So you've got the new property, you've got the new kilns, you've got employees.
Yeah.
How many?
Probably
at this
about
point?
20.
So you got 20 at this time.
Yes.
2007, 2008. I know exactly what was going on then.
Yeah. You were in the business.
What-
Not the lumber business, but in the
But
investment
just in the
business.
the world. And
Yeah.
so, what's going through your mind at that point? What's your strategy?
Well, we didn't know.
Right.
We didn't know how serious this would be. So I didn't really build a strategy because we were very fast moving. Like we
Right.
could build an inventory up quickly.
Right.
And by taking a bit of a hit, we could get rid of it relatively quickly,
Right.
within 6 months.
Yeah.
And so my strategy was, is if it comes in big and bad, we will reduce the inventory considerably.
Right.
But anyway, we were still working with these kilns, but there was so much kiln space available in Vancouver. The kilns that were available to me for custom drying were so cheap that you could never make a living building your own.
Right.
So we put it on mothballs, and we never did build the kilns.
So you
But
brought them, and just
we invested $300 and some odd thousand in them, and now I want to go back a little bit.
Yeah.
Before this, I bought into a sawmill up in Squamish called AJ Forest Products.
Okay.
And I was a partner with Probin Industries, which is another very large, they're mostly in the log business, log broker, log manufacturer, and they owned a few little mills, and they owned 2/3 and I owned 1/3.
Right.
Didn't start that way. I owned one third, they owned 1/3, and the third owner sold his shares to them.
Right.
So it was really difficult for me to own this mill with these people because they were big and they had the majority of the shares, and what they said goes, and I probably would have done the same thing. So anyway, I gave them I pulled the shotgun on them and gave them a good offer on it, which they decided to match and keep their shares. So I was out of the sawmill business.
Right.
I always wanted to be in it, but anyway.
And how long was that for?
A couple of years.
A couple of years,
yeah,
okay.
Probably, I'm trying to remember the year, but I would guess 2003 to maybe 2004 to 2006, something like that.
Okay.
So we got a little bit of money back, and we used that for the kiln project.
Okay.
So that was one of my initial failures. We all have some. The mill wasn't, because we actually made money on it, but the kiln project was a failure. We had to scrap all the metal eventually, and we got probably 20 cents on the dollar for what we paid for the whole project. So from there, so we went into the very difficult times, and everyone in lumber was basically losing money.
Right.
It didn't matter if you were a sawmill, the truckers were hurt, everybody that was associated with the lumber industry, and probably your industry as well, your investors in that were suffering. I mean, it was just a terrible time.
Yeah.
If you had housing property anywhere but Vancouver, you were getting hit.
Oh, absolutely.
Somehow Vancouver came away unscathed with that.
For the time being.
For the time being, yeah.
It's catching up,
It's
I
here
think,
now. Yeah, as we know. I just put my house for sale, and I've had it for sale for 6 months, and it's down $600,000 from my original asking price. So,
wow.
And I'm in Coquitlam, so I can imagine what Vancouver's going through.
Yeah.
But anyway, in about 2009, my son Jake, he's a very bright young man. He came with me out of the UBC Wood Sciences program.
Okay.
And he just jumped in, and I said, Jake, I'm not ready for you, because I was expecting you to come out of the school in a couple of years, because he basically did 3 or 4 years in it, and then he said that I can't learn anymore. Here's time to come out. So he just sort of ended up on my doorstep one day. So he said, don't worry about it, Dad. He says, I'll just put my boots on, I'll go down the yard, and I'll just be helpful. So he went out, and I never once told him what he had to do or asked him what he was doing. I just know he was in and out, running around, doing whatever had to be done that wasn't being done, and learning very, very quickly.
Interesting.
And so within about a year, he was basically running the quality control in the company. Our other quality control man, he had graduated into sales, so he was no longer in quality. So his timing was good. So anyway, he was the one that was responsible for being aggressive and looking at new equipment, and because he had all this education and the new way of doing things, modernizing the company. And we were starting to lose a little bit of money. We had about 3 years in a row where we lost, a couple of $100,000 a year. It wasn't big, but it was still.
It's
it was going the wrong way.
Yeah, exactly.
So I said to Jake, I'm in my mid-50s now, and it might be time that we look at some sort of a transfer of ownership here. And he said, well, yeah, I'm ready right now. He was 28 at the time, so he was full of pea and vinegar, and I didn't know that he was ready or not, but I said, well, if you're serious, why don't you work out in your own mind what this place is worth? and I'll work out in my own mind what the place is worth. And let's go back and forth until we come to a deal. I said, but I have to warn you, I can't give it to you because you have two other brothers and sisters. They're not in the business. They have normal lives. One's a teacher, one's a nurse, and we can't disrupt the estate.
Right.
It's got to be equal.
Yeah.
And so he said, no, I understand that. I said, so you got to give me a market value, and we'll both determine what it is. So he and I went back and forth for 6 months and had no arguments, just, no, I can't live with that, or yes, I can. And we went back and forth. And within about 6 months, we shook hands. And he got a great deal because the market was down. And I got a great deal because I could retire at 56 years old.
Right.
And I maintained the property, which I've just sold in the last month.
Okay.
And
to the company?
No, I sold it to the BD Group.
Okay.
Big company.
Yep.
But got a lease set out for Jake for 5 more years. And he's so darn entrepreneurial, I don't have any fear that he'll find what he needs to make the company work. And BD accommodated the lease. They didn't want to, but they did.
Right.
So anyway, he took it over in 2011, and he's built it up. I think he's got, any given day, 30 to 40 employees. Some of them are what we refer to as contract workers, and they're people that are in the lumber business, but they don't have a company. They just have a labor company. So they know about lumber, grading, tallying, and all that. So there's semi-skilled workers.
Right.
So he brings in a lot of those at any given time. And he put in his own kilns again. We came back to the kilns, and very successfully.
Oh, good.
Yeah. And he's got 3 production lines. He's got green chains. And he's a very good employer. He pays his guys real well. And I walk around there all the time, just to visit, and they all seem to be really happy and into the job. And
how many shifts do they run?
Just one.
Just the one shift, okay.
Yeah, they've never gone. I think they have some evening shifts.
Okay.
But generally speaking, they're a one-shift company.
Okay.
Again, if we go back to supply or the size of the industry, the cedar industry has taken a real hit on supply.
So where's your main market there for cedar? And that brings me to another thing. We talked about it almost as an aside. We talked about mid-'70s, the lumber industry, accounting for 70% of the GDP or I guess it's not GDP of the province.
Yes.
And now we're down to 10 to 12% or 12 to 15%.
Right.
What have you seen changed over time? And what, obviously you've seen a lot change and a lot of innovation and a lot of hardship as well. What can you put your finger on kind of the things that were changing, and did you see them changing in real time and recognize things were changing, or how did it feel as that went?
Every year some other mill got gobbled up by a bigger mill. It's sort of like most industries, I believe.
So consolidation's happening?
Consolidation was big. The small guys successfully, they were successful businesses, and big mills like successful businesses, so they paid big dollars, and the little guys retired. And so the industry was getting tighter and tighter with the amount of supply base out there. It was being spread around much fewer sawmills. Probably went from several hundred in British Columbia to maybe 100 to maybe 75 to maybe 30 to 50 now. And that includes the coastal industry as well. So there might be more than that. But, the sequence is right. It's really big to going down. And it employed, I might be guessing, but I think 100,000 plus British Columbians at that time. And now I think it employs 30 to 40,000 directly.
I mean, that's a huge change. And that's going to be a huge change in attitudes to how people look at the forestry industry, too, because there's not as many people working it anymore. So they're going to be, looking at it from, different with a different lens.
Absolutely. And the environmental movement, of course, had a massive impact.
Yeah.
Clear cutting got basically eliminated. It hasn't been, but the massive cuts that you saw on the sides of mountains, you no longer see.
No.
They're more smaller type cuts. So they had a big impact. And the sawmills became extremely complex, all electronics. And so they would go, when my dad worked at Fraser Mills in New Westminster, a shift change would be 1,000 people per shift.
Wow.
And now a sawmill on 3 shifts will run on 50 to 100 people.
What a change.
And produce twice as much or 3 times as much.
Yeah, because it's all electronic. It's all feeding the beast. The machine just keeps running.
Exactly. And then another thing happened. The American sawmill industry was becoming smaller because they basically ran through their country and harvested a big percentage of their standing timber.
Now, when you deal with cedar, were you involved at any time with the softwood lumber tariffs? Did that affect you? And if it did, walk me through, because I remember it's an issue that seems to creep up every 5 or 6 years where it blows up again.
I was very involved in it. It started, the first one I remember was, they started talking about it in the early 80s. And in 85, they hit us with our first countervailing duty, I believe it was called.
I remember that.
And there was some ways you could, very simple ways that you could reduce your chances of being involved in it, but none of us knew about it.
Right.
So we all just walked blindly into it, and we all got charged our tariffs.
Because it was like 35% or something.
It was
crazy.
Yeah, I kind of forget. We've been through 6 of them now.
Yeah, because it's
I'd almost need a sheet of paper here to walk you through each one. But anyway, I wasn't that involved in that one. But I was working for my brother Pat at the time. And at the end of the countervailing duty, the little bit of money they took from our company came back to us after Canada won the international battle. And it was international because we had the World Trade Organization involved. And I don't even know if NAFTA was there yet. I don't think they were.
No,
they came in the 90s.
Because I know a number of them have happened. And I know one of the big issues with the last set of tariffs that went on is the U.S. lumber industry ended up keeping the money. I believe that
they
was
never
the
kept
case.
it. They kept a portion of it.
Portion of it, yes.
Yeah, that was when my business was booming, and probably 80% of it was going to the United States. And I think I got $6 or $7 million returned from duties, but they had kept $1 million or more of it.
Okay.
So that was our ticket to get out. So it was very disruptive to our business. We were spending a lot of our time just dealing with that rather than selling and buying and remanufacturing lumber.
So what was your role at that time during the negotiations? What position were you?
Well, I worked for a small group called the IWPA, which is the Independent Wood Processing Association. And I think I was the chairman at the time, and Russ Cameron was the paid president. So it was a association amongst us small manufacturers. And so I was quite involved with them, and we met with many government officials and worked very hard on it. And they've been fighting us ever since. And we're in the middle of another one now, which my son keeps me informed on. And another real difficult thing, I think they've got $2 or $3 million of our company money all tied up in it, and it'll be more by the time it's done. So it's a difficult thing being attacked. Every few years, we seem to look at this issue again and start all over.
Because if my understanding is correct, it all revolves around how Crown land stumpage is calculated.
Initially, yes. Basically, a lot of us theorize that the Americans want our timber. They want our logs. And that's what they're kind of working. They want our logs traded freely into the United States. Well, we have a mandate. It's public timber. And our mandate is to create jobs with our forestry. And so we need sawmills, and we need pulp mills, and we need remanufacturing plants, and all the little stuff that goes with that. Truckers are employed, brokers, custom brokers. Just a huge amount of companies are employed by what then was a massive industry. And that was another reason it became smaller, is because of the constant attacks by the U.S. So the industry's had a lot of things that have happened over the last 15 or 20 years to force it into a smaller industry. Now, the volumes may not be that small, but
that's
the efficiency is so good now that it just doesn't employ the people it once did.
Well, because if you're going from a mill that's doing what, you said 1,000 employees, and now
Basically
you've got
per shift.
per shift, and now
Yeah.
you've got 50 employees doing double the productivity.
Yes.
Essentially.
Yes.
That's a huge change.
It sure is. Yeah.
Now, what else have you seen changed over the years in the industry? Because now you left relatively young.
Yeah.
And
I retired early.
You seem healthy.
I'm not in bad shape.
That's
I'm able
always
to
a good
sit
thing.
up and take nourishment.
That's a good.
Or as my father used to say, it was that work in between meals that got me down. So all is good that way. Yeah, there's one of the problems when I was going through my career was the lack of young people coming into the business because it had such a bad rap. The industry was looked upon as a real polluter, and you used to see cartoons where they cut down trees and it would be just a huge bare mountain. So it really had a bad rap. So my old high school wouldn't even offer it. They'd have these career days.
Right.
And the lumber industry was never even indicated in them in that era. So that discouraged a lot of young, bright minds to come into the business. And BC is a leader in the forest industry. I mean, we've invented and created many things that are intact today. But these bright young guys were going into other industries. Mm-hmm. But they're starting to come back now because the industry has, first of all, it's very advanced. It's computerized. And so there's a lot of well-educated young guys starting to come into the business and just develop different aspects of the industry. But it's still getting smaller because the fiber source, particularly on the coast here, mm-hmm. has been reduced considerably. So that was a biggie. What else? Well, the equipment, the kilns, and the saws and the remanufacturing equipment has become extremely efficient, even for our small companies. Mm-hmm. So that's been reduced. We don't need to have as much or as many people on the green chains, if you will.
Right. So, just walking back, because you brought up a good point earlier that you came from a lumber family. Your grandfather worked in the pulp mill in New Westminster. Your dad was in the business. You and how many of your brothers went in the business?
Me and 5 brothers.
5 brothers. Yeah. Now, this generation, is it just your one son who's gone into business? Or?
Well, I owned a few companies, and mm-hmm. one of my other companies was called Powerhouse. Mm-hmm. And my nephew, Ross, has mm-hmm. taken it over and been very successful. He has expanded it into many products, and what he specializes in is the house envelope.
Okay.
Which is the efficient, what makes your home efficient. So right. He does paper wrap, he does rain screen, that sort of products, and he's built it into quite a going concern. So that's one of the business, and then we created a remanufacturing company which worked with PowerWood, mm-hmm. so it was sort of one and the same. We also had a log and lumber company where we attempted to custom cut logs for our production. Mm-hmm. We did a little bit of that, but again, the log industry is very captive. It's very difficult to infiltrate. So
interesting. So I want to ask this of everyone. If you can go back 20 years ago, 25 years ago, and give Steve Power one piece of advice, what would you say to him?
Never give up.
Never give up.
Yeah, there's a lot of odds against me because I come from a lumber family, and mm-hmm. When you leave your brother, and there's a lot of rumors circling around, and unfortunately there was a lawsuit, and so it was difficult, and the stress was incredible. When I started my business in the first year, I would get into the office between 4:30 and 5, and mm-hmm. sometimes I wouldn't leave until well after 1 o'clock in the morning. So this would go on 5 to 7 days a week for the first year. One of my suppliers, who I became very good friends with, he got up early one morning and phoned the office. Mm-hmm. He says, "Steve, I'm an old guy." He says, "But you're never going to get there if you don't slow down."
Interesting.
So that's where I realized the importance of having the right people in the right place.
Right.
So what I would say to young people is it's not easy. And your eyes are bulging because you're so into it. When you're at dinner with your family, they're sort of nudging you to pay attention. Yeah. It's all-encompassing.
Yes.
And
I've had that criticism made of me many times.
Yes, I'm sure you have. Well, you're in business. Business does that to people. It's all-encompassing. Like I had two priorities. Number one was the family. And so I felt this business was a requirement to provide my family with what I wanted to provide them with, and was successful with the business and with the family. All my kids are contributing citizens. They have nice families. They have nice spouses. My wife and I are tickled. We got 6 grandchildren and 1 more on the way.
Awesome.
Yeah. So, So you got to prioritize. And I think family has to be the reason that you're doing what you're doing. If you don't have a reason for it, let's face it, business is greed-based, but at least you got a reason for your greed. And don't be afraid to be greedy.
No.
Don't be crooked.
No, that's
But
different.
don't be afraid to ask for profit.
Yes.
Yeah. And that's one thing I never was. I demanded a big profit because we were really good at what we did. And when a customer got our wood, there was no issues. And in the specialty business, that is the biggest problem, is claims, where you have problems with the wood when it gets to California or to New York. And it's extremely costly both for you and the customer. So we made a point of quality control, doing it right. But if there was a problem, we took care of it. And so we were honest, we were aggressive, and we did well.
That I think is a great place to end it here.
All right.
Thank you so much for joining me, Steve. That is a fantastic story.
Happy to do it.
Thanks
Thank
again.
you.
Hey, thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and visit us at our website at greggoernert.com. That's GregGoernert.com. Thanks again.